Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this webinar hosted by the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're each joining today. I'm joining from Naarm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be joining us today. My name is Rebecca Burns, and I'm a PhD scholar at the ANU School of Regulation and Global Governance, as well as the Legal Strategy Director of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. And today we're here to celebrate the launch of Climate Obstruction, a global assessment, which is a significant piece of work that's brought together close to 100 scholars from around the world to map and analyze how organized interests are working to delay or derail climate action. And the timing of this event feels particularly apt because the Senate's Select Committee on Information Integrity on Climate Change and Energy has just released its final report yesterday as well. So today we'll hear more about the global assessment on climate obstruction, how it links with the findings of the Select Committee and the state of climate obstruction in Australia and more broadly. And we're honoured to be joined by two speakers today. So our first speaker is Professor Christian Downie from the ANU School of Regulation and Global Governance, or RegNet. Christian is the director of the Governing Energy Transition Lab and is an author and co-editor of Climate Obstruction, a Global Assessment, which was listed by the Financial Times in the Best Environmental Books of 2025, and which we'll, of course, be discussing today. Christian will speak about the global assessment and its findings and offer some reflections on its relevance to current climate policy debates in Australia, as well as the Senate report. And we're also delighted to be joined by Marian Wilkinson. Marian is a multi-award-winning investigative journalist, including the winner of 2 Walkley Awards. Marian was a reporter at ABC TV's Four Corners, where she was its first female executive producer. She has been a foreign correspondent and deputy editor for the Sydney Morning Herald. Her books include The Fixer, Dark Victory, along with David Marr, and The Carbon Club. And Marian recently published a quarterly essay titled Woodside versus the Planet. Marian will also share her reflections on the current state of climate obstruction and the Senate report. And we'll hear from both Christian and Marian first, and then open up for questions. So please do feel free to start raising questions at any time through the Q&A function while Christian and Marian are speaking, and then we'll aim to get through as many of them as we can at the end of the session. So thanks very much, everyone. Really delighted to have you all here today. And with that, I'll hand over to Christian first to talk about the book, Climate Obstruction, a Global Assessment. Thank you, Christian.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks for the kind introduction and for everyone for joining us today. Let me just share my screen here. I've got a couple of slides to share with you all that I hope everybody can see there. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be launching this book today in Australia, and timely too, I think, given that the Senate report on climate misinformation and disinformation was released yesterday evening. I'll say a little bit more about that later. But let me first start with the book and why we're here today. So there is an overwhelming body. Well, I guess there's 2 things that stand out when we think about. I'm just trying to share the slides here. I'll get them moving. There's 2 things that stand out, I think, for those of us that are familiar with climate change and climate politics. The first is simply just the overwhelming body of scientific evidence that the Earth is heating up. We've had, I think, 6 major assessment reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change now over 4 decades confirming this. The second thing that really stands out, and won't be a surprise to most of us listening today, is simply that societies haven't really responded adequately. I mean, we've really failed to, confront the reality of this science. So there is that question of why. Why are we failing? Why is our planet still on track to warm by 3 or perhaps even 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels? Now, there's plenty of reasons that are often put forward for that. Some people talk about technology shortcomings. Others will talk about democratic deficits. And in the book, we don't really dispute those arguments, but we offer an alternative one. And that is that for more than a decade, and this is work based on not just my own work or even a handful of scholars, the work of hundreds of scholars now showing this accumulating body of evidence that one of the reasons that society hasn't responded adequately is because we've failed to understand the groups and networks of actors that are obstructing action on climate change, and we've failed to deal with that and overcome it. So along with my co-editors, Timmins Roberts, Carlos Milani, and Jennifer Jacquet, plus a global team of 27 lead authors. I think there's about 70 plus contributing authors, and across about 25 countries. Thankfully, we had a managing editor to help us manage all of this as well, Miranda Spencer. But what we've really done is the first kind of synthesis of all the peer-reviewed evidence around climate obstruction. And I think given the scale of this effort and its global nature, it's really a quantum leap in our understanding of who's obstructing action on climate change and how they're doing it. So you can go to the book's out now. It's published by Oxford University Press. You can go and purchase online. One of the other nice features of this book is we worked with Oxford Uni Press to make this freely available. So you can go to their website, you can download it for free as a PDF as well, as we wanted to get these findings out far and wide. So this afternoon, I really just want to talk about these three questions. What is climate obstruction? Who's doing it? How do they do it? What are their political strategies? And then I'll spend a little bit of time reflecting on the Senate report that came out yesterday. So what is climate obstruction? Well, perhaps the best way to illustrate it is with one of the kind of classic cases. So I think everyone will have heard of ExxonMobil. It's the largest publicly listed oil and gas company in the world. In fact, it has operations on 6 of the world's 7 continents. And back in the 1970s and 1980s, it was really at the forefront of research on carbon dioxide emissions and the impact they were having on the climate. Scientists inside the firm were very well resourced. They even had funding for ocean tankers that were looking at how carbon dioxide was being absorbed into the oceans. By the 1970s, Exxon's Mobil scientists were publishing in leading peer-reviewed journals on this and explaining how carbon emissions were shaping our climate. By the 1980s, they've been warning the leadership of the corporation that fossil fuels may need to be phased out if we're going to address climate change. But we also know, thanks to the work of journalists, particularly from Inside Climate News, but they weren't the only ones, that what ExxonMobil's leadership decided to do was not to transition the firm away from oil and gas and meet the moment, but rather it was to silence scientists inside the corporation and then spend decades and tens of millions of dollars denying the scientific basis of climate change. We also know that Exxon was not the only one. And this is probably a classic case of what we describe in the book as climate obstruction. What we're talking about is these intentional actions by corporations like Exxon and others to block policies on climate change in ways that aren't consistent with the science. The other key point here is that not all groups are equally responsible for climate change or for obstruction. And thanks to the growing, particularly, it's actually happened very, very quickly over the last few decades, the developments in attribution science, we now know that there's a series of studies that have pointed out that particular companies are perhaps more liable than others. So there was an initial study back in 2014, you can see there, that 90 carbon majors, this is firms in the oil, gas, coal and cement industries, they calculated were responsible for about 63% of cumulative CO2 and methane emissions. Subsequent studies have confirmed that, and they've even pinpointed to what extent these firms are responsible for particular rise in sea levels or in ocean temperatures. And a recent study came out just last year talking about the contribution of 180 companies, how much difference they'd made to historical heat waves, both the frequency and the intensity. So what makes, I guess, some of these corporations more culpable than others is not only that they are responsible for a large chunk of emissions, but many of them, because of their in-house scientific expertise, actually knew the damage it was causing, but they didn't stop it. What they did is continue to make a lot of money from their activities and then use some of those revenues to block and oppose climate action. And it's no surprise, I guess, that some of these firms are now being found liable in courts around the world for this behaviour. So the next question I'd like to turn to is who is obstructing action on climate change? Now, one of the key findings is that it was oil and gas corporations, but it wasn't just oil and gas. So a lot of the early work, early scholarship has focused on firms like Exxon, Shell, Chevron, Total, and others. Um, but they aren't the only ones. Uh, they're important, of course, because these companies in particular have funded, I guess, probably tens of millions, if not more, of campaigns to deny the science of climate change since the 1980s. They funded television campaigns, radio, TV, more recently, social media. But they aren't the only ones. We've got a lot of evidence in the book about the role of firms in the coal industry. The utility industry, particularly in the United States in the 1990s, for example, has been central to efforts to overturn action on climate change. Transport industry, particularly the meat and dairy industry and the agricultural sector. And we also see groups representing large portions of the business community involved as well. So it's clear that when we think about who's obstructing action on climate change, we tend to think of ExxonMobil and others, but it's a much wider problem than that. The other question we look at in the book is how are they doing it? What are their political strategies? One of the things that really showed up, we focused on the period after the Paris Agreement. So we really looked at the last decade since 2015. And what you find is that actors these days are spending a lot less time denying the science of climate change and much more time creating doubt about the severity of the issue, challenging the viability of solutions. I know Marian will probably talk more about this in a moment, but questioning whether solar will work, it's too expensive, and really challenging the solutions. And then, of course, we've seen this in our country, just a wave of greenwashing. We've seen successful prosecutions in recent years from ASIC, for example, our financial regulator, for companies that have been involved in misleading consumers. The other thing that comes out clearly in the book is that we're really looking at a network of actors that are shaping and obstructing climate and energy policy. This is done by a colleague of mine, Robert Brawl, at Brown University in the United States. So this is a picture for the US, but what you see here is it's not just industry and corporations and wealthy individuals, but the work is also being done by trade associations, think tanks, advertising agencies, lobbying firms, and others. There is very much an interlocking network of organisations that have been engaged in climate obstruction. From the empirical evidence, three things stand out about which of these groups of organisations are really enabling it. And there was three that we focused on in the book: trade associations, PR firms like Edelman being one of the largest in the world, and think tanks. There's lots of evidence about the role of think tanks that are part of this Atlas network. This is a global network of neoliberal think tanks that have consistently worked to oppose climate action. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about trade associations and drawing on some work I've done with colleagues in the US. Just to give you an indication of the amount of money that's being spent in this space. So we went through the tax records of about 90 trade associations that work on climate change and energy policy in the US. And you can see here, this is their revenues across a decade, grouped by industry or sector. So you can see the oil and gas industry there in purple. Over a decade, they had $4.5 billion US in revenue. The utility industry had a lot as well. Peak trade associations, these are groups that represent the entire business community, like a chamber of commerce. Again, more than $4.3 billion. If you cast your eye over to the bottom right of this diagram, the small dark blue box there, you can see that the revenues of groups that typically support climate action, like the Wind Association, Solar Association, their revenues are dwarfed by that of industries that tend to oppose action on climate change. The other question then was, okay, well, that's how much they have at their disposal. How much are they spending? About 13% of their total revenues were spent on political activities, or $3.4 billion. This is US dollars, right? So we're probably talking $6+ billion Australian is being spent on political activities. I should say this is just by industry groups. We know from the literature that firms themselves spend this amount and more again. The other thing that was nice about this data is we could look at where the money was going, like what types of political activities are they spending it on. The vast majority, more than 2/3 or 2.2 billion there, is being spent on PR firms and advertising campaigns. That's 3 times what's being spent on lobbying and a lot more than what they're giving in grants or, interestingly, political contributions. In this country, if you pick up newspapers and other things, you'll see that we focus a lot on political contributions. There's a reason for that because they tend to be disclosed more than other political activities. But you can see it's just the tip of the iceberg. If you just focus on political contributions, you're missing the huge amounts that are being spent on other activities. And I'm happy in the Q&A to talk about what some of this money was spent on. So that's the US. What about here in Australia? Well, none of this is particular to the US. These types of activities and organisations are active here in Australia. Unfortunately, we don't have the same spending data. Ironically, disclosure practices here in Australia actually aren't as good on some issues than the United States. But there's ample evidence that similar industry associations, similar public relations firms and others are doing this type of work here. This is a slide from some work that was just released that I did with a colleague, Darren Halpin. We looked at who are all the organisations that are mobilising on climate policy in Australia between 2017 and 2022. So we looked at industry groups, firms, think tanks, environmental NGOs across different political arenas. Happy to explain this further later. But what you can see is those groups that are most active. Quite a few of them in that top 20 have a history of opposing climate policy. BHP, AGL, the Business Council of Australia, was obviously very active in the recent debates on greenhouse gas targets in this country. Adani, the Minerals Council of Australia. Minerals Council of Australia, one of the biggest trade associations, represents many of the big miners and energy firms. It has a long history back to the 1990s of trying to derail climate policies, including when Australia was actually thinking about carbon pricing all the way back in the 1990s as well. But many of these groups are still active. It was reported in the press, for example, that at the last election, the Minerals Council of Australia had seconded a member of its staff into the campaign headquarters of Peter Dutton, for example. So we know a lot of these groups are very active politically. And you can see also there, Woodside comes in at number 12. And if you haven't read it already, Marian's terrific quarterly essay on Woodside. But they're obviously a very important player here too. So before I finish up, let me talk about the Senate committee. So I think it started in August or September last year. There's been this Senate committee chaired by the Greens, but it's got Labor senators, Liberal senators, National senators on it, including independent senators as well. And they've been looking at climate misinformation and disinformation and its impact on Australian politics. So the report was released at about 7 p.m. last night. I haven't read all of it. It's 294 pages. But what it does conclude, and this is based on, I think it was, I got the numbers here, 247 written submissions, 11 days of public hearings. And what they've concluded in that report is that Australia really is facing a wave of misinformation and disinformation around climate change and energy. It's not only a threat to our capacity as a society to act on climate change, but it's also a threat to the health of Australia's democracy. And there were some extraordinary revelations in the testimony and in the written submissions. Just to give you one example of the extent of misinformation in Australia, there was testimony from a New South Wales farmer. All of this is on the record and you can look it up. But a New South Wales farmer who told the story of how a 500 kilowatt community battery project in Narrabri, New South Wales. Now, it was initially supported by the local council, but it was later blocked following a misinformation campaign. There was Facebook pages claiming that the battery would blow up, it would catch on fire, it might have to shut the town down if it went ahead. Of course, none of this was substantiated by evidence. But these were the types of revelations that different groups were talking about in this committee. The committee also uncovered, this network of organisations, which is more evident in the US, but exists here too, to slow, stop, reverse policies on climate change, what we're referring to as climate obstruction. And a good example is the other point to make there is that there are a whole range of organisations like trade associations, like think tanks, like public relations firms that play a part in that, including in astroturfing. And this is creating kind of fake community groups that are then used to persuade policymakers and the public that there is support or opposition for something when it's just not the case. So there was a group, to give you one illustration, a group called Australians for Natural Gas. This is a pro-gas group, but it turns out that the group, although it's seemingly a grassroots organisation, was set up by the head of Tambora Resources with the help of a PR firm called Freshwater Strategy. So we're seeing a lot of this astroturfing behaviour, and it's really hard for local communities to tell what are legitimate groups and what are groups set up by other means. The other thing that struck me when I was looking through parts of the report yesterday evening was just how important social media and AI are here. So the report talks about how AI and social media are fueling misinformation. Senators heard about the algorithms, particularly in social media firms like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and how they're really prioritising, and I don't think this will come as a surprise to many of you, but they're prioritising engagement over accuracy. As a result, you get these echo chambers and you just get the spread of misleading content. What was also really interesting was that some of these social media corporations are really just doing nothing about it. Executives from Meta, so that's the organisation that owns Facebook and Instagram, they copped a grilling by senators I think it was a couple of months ago now. And under questioning, what it actually turned out was that they are spending more on lobbying in Australia. So Facebook and Instagram are spending more on lobbying in Australia than they're actually spending on fact checking. And it also appeared that they were planning to do almost nothing on fact checking going forward. AI is also making it making it easier for groups to spread false information. It's just much easier now to create a fake social media post, to create a fake video, a fake picture. And AI assistants like Claude, for example, it was also revealed in testimony just last month, were really helping to scale up these types of political operations as well. So what did the committee recommend? Well, it had a whole raft of recommendations. It did acknowledge, which I completely agree with, there's no simple fix here. But it recommended things like greater transparency around lobbying and donations, better media literacy, including in our school curriculums, independent monitoring and funding so that we can really track misinformation across platforms, and supporting independent media organisations, including in regional Australia. At the end of the report that the committee released, there were some additional sections from individual senators or pairs of senators, and some of them suggested going further, banning donations from fossil fuel organisations, legislating truth in political advertising. And I think this one's really significant, and where the government should act is compelling social media companies just to remove fake content. Now, that's going to require them to spend some resources on that, but to remove fake content, to label misleading content, and to deal with the bots that are running riot on their platforms. I think many of these are very worthy recommendations. The important thing now is for the Albanese government to act, ideally to act before the next election, because clearly this problem is not going to go away. And as the Senate committee concluded, it's not just climate change and energy policy that is at stake here, but also the health of our democracy. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Contact details there. Feel free to reach out, and I'll hand over to Marian.
Thanks, Christian, and thanks, Rebecca. And hello, everyone, and thanks to you for joining us. It's a privilege to be here for the Australian launch of this extraordinary book that Christian and his fellow authors have amassed from people all over the world. The power of this global assessment on climate obstruction is in its forensic detail and its sweep of the history. It captures over 4 decades, in country after country, the many efforts of the fossil fuel industry in particular and its political supporters to at first deny and then obstruct and then delay meaningful policies on climate change. So reading it for me was a sobering experience, as we stand poised, if you like, on the 1.5 degree threshold of global warming. And I have to admit, Christian, it was also a depressing read because as a journalist who's written and broadcast on climate change for the last 2 decades, this book made me feel like an extra in Groundhog Day. I finished the last chapter of Climate Obstruction just before the South Australian election last weekend. And on Monday, I switched on the ABC to hear One Nation's Barnaby Joyce raging against renewable energy and warning the major parties that the voters who'd flocked to Pauline Hanson on the weekend were there because of the government's support for net zero. He was on fire. So his lines were very clear. Obviously, he said climate change policies have been devastating for our nation, devastating for energy security, devastating for cost of living, yet people somehow feel morally obliged to keep driving Australia's economic nose into the dirt. I quote, but Barnaby's lines, of course, along with his performance, could have been lifted straight from the climate obstruction playbook that's detailed in this study. This is exactly the kind of messaging that has been workshopped over years by not only the fossil fuel industry, but its supporters, the PR agencies, as Christian mentioned, the advertisers and the lobbyists and the think tanks. The messaging at its heart is simple, and that messaging is that action on climate change is dangerous for the national economy and dangerous for local communities. What's critical about the new book we're talking about today is that it follows the evolution of climate obstruction campaigns from the straight-out climate science denialism that Christian was talking about in the 80s and 90s to what the authors call the climate delayism and obstruction of today. Our arguments against climate change have shifted from using misinformation to attack climate science to using misinformation to attack the solutions to the climate crisis. These days, we regularly see politicians, global financial chiefs, oil and gas executives studiously avoiding any attacks on climate science, but challenging or undermining the effectiveness of solutions to deal with climate change. And you all know the arguments well. Renewables are unreliable, they can't be used in industrial processes, net zero will lead to higher power bills, cost of living pressures, job losses, and power blackouts. Now, many of the arguments, and we need to acknowledge this, have some truth in them, but they're skewed and exaggerated to obscure and obstruct the energy transition. And this has happened in the US, the UK, Europe, and they certainly mirror what I've seen in Australia. Indeed, I began following Barnaby Joyce's crusade against climate science close on to 2 decades ago after Kevin Rudd came to power, promising to act on climate change. As a young National Party senator, Joyce would tour the regions, warning families they'd pay $100 for a roast lamb dinner if Rudd's plans passed the Senate. And Joyce would add with his own flourish that Kevin's plan would see you having to live on a diet of wild-grown berries and lentils scavenged from your own backyard. He promoted climate skeptic scientists like Professor Ian Plimer, who today, of course, sits on the board of Gina Rinehart's Hancock Energy. And back then, climate science skeptics were lauded in the National Party, in One Nation, and in the Liberal Party. Joyce went on to become Deputy Prime Minister in Turnbull's government, but he never flagged in his efforts to blow up climate change policy, whether in the coalition or in Labor. And he was always cheered on by his good friend Gina Rinehart. Joyce has now come full circle, of course, to join Hanson in One Nation. And Rinehart is backing their party, helping to raise political donations for them from local fund managers by offering these fund managers a dinner at Mar-a-Lago with Donald Trump in exchange for their donations. Now, after her big win in South Australia with Barnaby on the weekend, Pauline Hanson outlined that she would soon be delivering One Nation's new climate and energy policy. And at the top of it was abolishing the Federal Department of Climate Change and replacing all large-scale renewable infrastructure with coal and nuclear power plants. Now, I know what you're thinking, that people like Joyce and Hanson are fringe players, perhaps even a joke. But it's critical to understand that when it comes to obstructing climate policy in Australia, they are increasingly sounding mainstream in their attacks on net zero and on renewable. And as Hanson herself puts it, I've got the guts to say what you're thinking. And that's directed to other political parties and to the business community. On climate now, the coalition are saying the same things as Hanson's. Joyce's old protege, Matt Canavan, is the new leader of the National Party. He was able to blow up the coalition's net zero policy from the opposition backbench, and he is as obstructionist to climate policy as One Nation is. It was Canavan who helped ensure that the Liberal leader, Susan Lee, had to ditch the party's net zero policy and renewables targets if she wanted to try and survive. She, of course, lost. The new leader, Angus Taylor, has never really embraced net zero, and he has used the messaging of climate obstruction since he first entered Parliament. Taylor, like Canavan, opposes net zero targets now and loudly argues the unreliability of renewable energy and says, of course, that it puts up energy bills. That's why it is really worth reading this new book on climate obstruction that Christian has co-edited. It shows how climate obstruction and delay, rather than climate denial, evolved to become mainstream thinking. And that is mainstream thinking in many of the boardrooms of the global oil and gas companies, coal companies, and I would argue a lot of the global financial industry and the tech world, as well as their political allies. That evolution began in the aftermath of the Paris Agreement, when the oil and gas majors like Shell and BP and Total came out in support of acting on climate change, distanced themselves from the coal industry because they thought they could pursue a lucrative strategy of coal replacing gas. The high point of the oil and gas industry's support for climate action came in the early 2020s, as the book points out, when public protests and lawsuits against them were surging, when they were seeing the defeat of Trump and the election of President Biden, who pledged support for net zero and the Paris Agreement. But the fossil fuel industry's support for net zero and climate action rapidly waned after the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the global energy shock that saw oil and gas prices rebound, along with investment in new gas development. There's a fascinating new study from a group called Climate Creatives on corporate advertising from this time, from 2021 to 2024. And it shows companies like BP, Shell, Exxon, and Chevron shifting their soft line ads promoting themselves as part of the solution to climate change to much tougher new ads with the line, "You can't live without us." The research from these advertising executives, who forensically went through a lot of these ads, found a consistent and coordinated narrative shift that went from attempts to portray the companies as climate leaders to embracing the new message, the world can't function without oil and gas. And I really saw this messaging at the time of the COP in Dubai. It was repeated ad nauseum by the then COP host, Sultan Al Jaber, the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. And as the Climate Obstruction book shows, this messaging was in line with the new messaging coming from industry that sees climate more as a long-term risk rather than a palpable reality, and pushing the line that renewable energy solutions are unreliable basically not possible without a permanent fossil fuel presence in the energy system. I heard this message a lot when I was in Western Australia researching and reporting my quarterly essay on Woodside. It came from many in the WA Labor Party, as well as the Liberal Party, and of course industry. And that message is increasingly taking over the Australian energy and climate debate today, I would argue, drowning out the voices of climate scientists and energy transition policy experts. It dominates the climate messaging in Donald Trump's America, and it has a name, and the name is the New Energy Realism. It's their shorthand for saying fossil fuel energy means energy affordability and energy reliability, and energy realism is dependent on the permanent use of large amounts of fossil fuels. The current energy shock from the Iran war is only likely to reinforce this messaging. Today, as we sit here, the most influential energy conference in the world is taking place in Houston, Texas, the CERAWeek conference that some of you, I'm sure, know of. It was at this same conference last year that the fossil fuels industry's new messaging on energy realism ramped up. It was spelt out by the CEO of Aramco, the Saudi energy giant, who described what he called a wave of dissatisfaction with the energy transition that was crashing over countries all over the world and consumers alike. He argued the future of energy was not just about sustainability, i.e. climate change, it was about security and affordability. And while this could include renewables, he insisted that they would only complement conventional energy and not in any meaningful way replace fossil fuel energy. So this is the messaging we see in the ads from the industry groups that Christian talked about, like the Minerals Council of Australia. So in the 2025 election, Minerals Council ran a series of ads headed "Mining Keeps the Lights On," followed by the line, "Over half of our electricity generation relies on Australian coal." Well, of course, as a statement of fact, that was, of course, true at the time. About 55% of generation then in the national energy market came from black and brown coal. But you probably also know that all the studies on climate change for the government say that if Australia is going to make net zero emissions by 2050, coal needs to exit the electricity grid over the next decade. Australia is supposed to get to 82% of renewable energy in the grid, maybe not by 2030, as Chris Barnes says, but at least within a few years of that. That message is never there in those ads. Gas Lobby has had similar ads during the election campaign, headlined "Australia runs on natural gas." No mention that gas generation makes up only a small proportion of the national electricity market compared to renewables, including wind, solar, and hydro. So coming back to the climate obstruction study, we see in Australia now very well-funded lobby groups, and they made a big appearance in the 2025 election, who ferociously are opposing any tougher action on climate change policy. Australians for Prosperity, for example, made a big appearance funded by coal companies. Advance Australia made a big appearance in the campaign, and their biggest donor, surprise, surprise, was Gina Rinehart. While Advance has close links to the right wing of the Liberal Party, it also claims to be independent and grassroots, even though its election ads target Labor, the Greens, and the Teals. But Advance today is one of the most influential lobbies campaigning at a local level as well as a macro level against climate change policy and renewable energy. And their messaging they use, again, is absolutely forensically detailed in the book that Christian has helped to co-edit. Now, as Christian mentioned, the Senate inquiry into climate misinformation and integrity in climate change and energy communication, their report came down last night. And Advance Australia, of course, became very much a subject of the Senate inquiry. But rather than duck the inquiry, Advance made a very powerful submission to it, in which it tried to respond to criticism of their tactics and methods, especially their use of social media to kind of supercharge their messages on climate change, many of which are misinformed or misinformation. But their CEO, Matthew Sheehan, staunchly defended the campaigns, arguing that Advance itself was the movement of real Australians who do not oppose net zero because of misinformation or because they're paid to do so, but they oppose it because it's bad for the country, making life worse, and it won't make a difference to the climate. He also turned the attack back on the senators, telling them that they were the bad guys, that there was one piece of truth in what they were doing, and that was the admission that they are fighting for the climate. As Sheehan said, that's true, but you're fighting an abstraction. You are the Don Quixotes tilting at windmills, fighting a battle that's not real. That is not to say the climate is not changing, but the idea that you are able to do anything to stop it is not real. You believe Chinese-made solar panels and wind turbines can change the weather, and then you have the audacity to say Advance deals in misinformation. Now, that to me is straight out of the messaging we are hearing in America, in Europe, coming out of very well thought out campaigns that are honed to promote the idea that there is not a solution to climate change. Advance might be at the extreme end of the climate obstruction messaging, but they are reaching a lot of voters. And I think this is really important because that kind of messaging, as Christian's book makes clear, it's helped by billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars, that goes into all these advertising, lobbying campaigns to control the narrative about climate change and the solutions. And I think, for me, what is happening is that in reality, many in the fossil fuel industry and their supporters have essentially circled right back to a de facto form of climate science denial. Because if you look at the other side of the message that climate solutions don't work, it's a message that we should ignore the scientific reality of the urgent threat from climate change. And so I would argue that climate scientists and those who accept we need an energy transition need to get their own version of an energy realism narrative. And that's a narrative that candidly talks about the difficulties, the real difficulties of the energy transition, how it will disrupt people's lives, how we are a long way off the levels of investment we need to make green steel, green cement, or green hydrogen economically viable, and that AI will put impossible pressures on a green grid. But that narrative also needs to speak up about the enormous progress that has also been made in renewable technology, and especially in things like battery storage. The new energy narrative also needs to reconnect the energy transition with the urgency that is being spelt out by the climate scientists. And I'm sure many of you this week will have seen the latest DAR report from the World Meteorological Organization. It found in 2025, ocean heat content reached the highest level in the observational record. Global mean temperatures over the last 11 years were the 11 warmest on record. That atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide are the highest level we've seen in something like 2 million years, and that real-time data is showing that levels of the three main greenhouse gases continue to increase in 2025. The climate scientists are telling us with increasing alarm that time is not on our side. The net zero by 2050 target is just 24 years away, less than the time some of you will have your home mortgages. So rational climate change debate is needed for rational climate change policies. And these need to be implemented at a rapid pace if we accept the forecasts of the climate scientist. And that's why I would argue that the Climate Obstruction book is so very, very timely today, as is the Senate inquiry report. And I urge you all to read both. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both Christian and Marian for your reflections. Thank you firstly to Christian for your work on the Climate Obstruction book and for sharing the findings with us today. It was obviously a huge project and a very critical one. And also thank you, Marian, for exposing some of these tactics in your work, both through your quarterly essay and your book, but more broadly and your reflections as well. I think I was particularly struck by the amount of resourcing going into climate obstruction, but also I think you both spoke to the fact that we've moved away from sort of classic denial to some of these more insidious tactics that are a bit more difficult to untangle. And it sounds like the Senate report has also really backed that up as well and perhaps shed more light on how this is really a growing problem in Australia. So time to move into Q&A. There's an opportunity to ask questions of both of our speakers. I do see some questions coming through, so that's fantastic. And I might just ask one to kick us off to sort of frame the Q&A, and then I'll turn to those. So if you are sitting on a question, please do throw it into the Q&A and we'll try and get through all of them. But perhaps just to start, because I think a big theme across both of your reflections was this transition from classic denial of the science to this more sort of delaying tactics to discourses of delay, I think it's called. Christian, you mentioned the New South Wales farmer and the sort of narrative around the battery being harmful. And Marian, you mentioned federal politicians using this language, but also the idea of new energy realism and the fact that these arguments sound quite reasonable to a layperson, perhaps who isn't able to disentangle when they're being misinformed. So I was wondering if you have reflections on how we actually might address this. So perhaps I'll turn to you first, Christian, and then come to Marian, and then we'll go to some other questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca, and thank you, Marian, too, for your kind comments and reflections. The question of how to address this problem is no easy one, Rebecca. So thanks for starting us off with a really difficult one. I appreciate it. But I think the Senate committee is correct, right? They're saying that there's no easy fix. There's no silver bullet for this type of thing. Often there's not for very difficult problems. I think some of the testimony talked about wicked problems, and this is certainly one of them. So I tend to agree with a lot of what the committee's proposed. I mean, I think some of the basic stuff like more transparency around donations, improving literacy in schools. I think there was a comment in the committee report also about making sure sponsorships of school curriculums, because fossil fuel companies have been sponsoring things in high schools. So all of those things make sense, but I would argue, and I think we saw it in some of the additional Senate reports, the government needs to go much further and deal with some of these structural problems. And so shedding a light will only do so much. I mean, one thing that was advocated by some of the other senators was saying, well, let's actually regulate these social media firms. So you literally just can't have, fake accounts and lies spreading on your platforms. And yet we saw with the testimony from Meta, the owner of Facebook and Instagram, that's simply not happening. They're going the other way in the US, I think, where it's probably a bit of a free-for-all given the relationships between big tech and the Trump administration. But here we have this opportunity now with this government to do something about it. And I think if we don't do something about it in this election cycle or very soon, then the train will have left the station and it will be so hard to make a case. So in answer to your question, Rebecca, I think one thing that we really need to tackle is the spread of lies and falsehoods and the platforms that they're on. It's not just social media, it's traditional media as well. But that would be a good starting point, addressing some of these structural issues through legislation and through regulation.
Marian, would you like to jump in there as well?
Yeah, well, I endorse what Christian is saying. I think it is a tricky one. It is a very difficult issue because you get into that whole complicated area of free speech, especially during election campaigns, allowing voters to have their say. But we have this dilemma now, especially with the social media companies, that anonymous material gets circulated, gets supercharged by bots and algorithms. And we saw it in the Brexit campaign, very much so. We saw a lot of it actually in the Voice campaign as well. And we certainly saw it in part in the 2025 election. You see it on climate issues all the time. I think that there has to be a way, at the very least, of when there are actual sort of ads or statements coming out, that you can't just not have a real person who is taking responsibility for them. I think that issue, as we had with election material, where people have to have an agent who's on it, I think that's critical. I think one of the really good recommendations coming out of the committee was putting a lot more pressure on the social media companies about the bot accounts that exist. I mean, anyone who follows social media on climate will know that they are everywhere. So there's some absolute basics to be done on the regulation side that I think are possible. But I think it sort of opens up a bigger question, both for the politicians, but also for people who are in the renewable energy industry, and for that matter, in the climate movement, that I think there needs to be a lot more dialogue and a lot more willingness to listen to what is going on, especially in rural, regional communities. I think one of the problems is that we forget even in the renewable energy industry, there is a lot of people who are just out there to make money, who approach the rural and regional communities in a very disrespectful way. So I think people also need to up the game on their own dialogue with people who aren't on the same page as they are. And finally, I get back to this issue, is that we need to have, once again, our senior politicians talking about climate science. If you look at the debate today on the energy transition, the lack of anyone willing to actually talk about the urgency of the climate science, I think, is very disturbing.
Thank you both. I think some really concrete and critical reflections there. So we've had a few questions come through, which is really great. I think I'm going to group some of them. So for the next batch of questions, these are somewhat related. I think the first one is probably quick to answer. I think you already addressed this a little bit, Christian, but the question is it time to ban fossil fuel advertising? And so maybe as a flip side of that, there's another question also about whether or not climate change is actually effective as a selling point. So for example, the example in the question is for buying electric vehicles. People often aren't motivated by the climate benefits when buying electric vehicles. Has that actually been a benefit to the climate deniers as such? Because there are other ways that people need to communicate about products, because people aren't necessarily motivated by climate change as a it's something to change their behavior, and perhaps that makes them more susceptible to advertising in the other direction as well. Hopefully those questions make sense. It's a little bit of a bundle. I'm not sure if either of you would like to jump in first, but whoever would like to respond to that, please go ahead.
Christian, I'll let you start.
Okay, sure. Well, yeah, I mean, on the just talking about the electric, I mean, the best way to probably understand how to sell an electric vehicle car is to look at what companies like BYD, etc., how they're selling them. They'll spend a lot more money and time thinking about their advertising campaigns than I will. But I'm sure that climate change in particular jurisdictions is more powerful in some and less influential in others, and they'll target their ads accordingly. But I think the key thing is that a lot of these technologies like EVs, the prices come down so much that they're actually attractive. They're an attractive proposition without a climate change angle, and probably very, very attractive now in the context of the Middle East conflict and the impacts on fuel prices. But the problem here is that when someone might go out to purchase a car, is that there's so much misinformation about batteries catching on fire all the time. So we've seen, and this was reported in some previous stuff, that there was a lot of fake social media posts and others saying that electric vehicles catch on fire more than petrol cars, and it's just simply not true. But if you're reading that, if that's coming on your social media stream, that may lead you to question whether you should purchase one. Same questions about the range of EVs, questions about battery fires. So yes, batteries catch on fire, but also apartment blocks are blown up by gas heaters as well. So it's very hard for the Australian public to often determine where the truth lies, and in part that's because misinformation is allowed to spread wildly. So unless we get to the bottom of the problem and stop some of the both who's spreading it and the platforms on which they spread it, then these types of things like uptake of electric vehicles and other renewable technologies is going to continue to face obstacles.
Yeah, I think that again, it's a two-way process. We do need tougher, I think, government regulation, especially on things like fossil fuel ads. Again, there is a freedom of speech issue here, but I think that there are some of the fossil fuel ads that really just do push the envelope, and they should be taken up by the authorities about whether it's the ACCC, whether it's ACMA, about truth in advertising. I think the EV issue is a really interesting example of this thing where there's been a lot of disinformation out about EVs, the fires, range anxiety, etc., etc. The range anxiety is clearly something where there is a problem. But I would argue the government has been equally tardy in ensuring that charging networks are readily available, again, particularly for people who are doing long distance journeys. So you need a kind of a two-pronged approach. I think you need to work on getting the disinformation down, but you also need to work on the genuine issues of infrastructure around new technologies like electric vehicles, where you actually are trying to work hand in glove with the consumer. I mean, it would be ludicrous to think that you would reduce the number of petrol stations on critical interstate corridors because you didn't feel like supporting them anymore, or you weren't interested in giving them any ability to lease land to put them in. People are very, very conscious about when petrol stations close down and people can't get access to fuel. It's a similar thing. The government here has to intervene. And I would argue that equally in rural Australia, if there was more of an effort to communicate with people about the benefits of actually having renewable energy in areas that are subject to high, natural disaster levels, that they're going to be a lot better off in the long term. I think this is where you need politicians to actually have some of those kitchen table type conversations, not on how terrible this is all going to be for you, but in fact of the benefits that could particularly flow to regional and rural Australia.
Thank you. Very, very comprehensive responses there. And I think an example where, yeah, it's challenging, I think, for people to disentangle some of the narratives as well in this particular area. But I wanted to ask a question for you, Christian, specifically now. The question is that the global assessment also looks at countries in the global south. And it's a global assessment, obviously. We've focused a lot today on Australia. But are there lessons that we can learn from other countries, and are there connections that the movement can make potentially between, civil society and the movement in Australia and in other countries as well, to kind of learn from each other and also tackle this as a global issue?
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks to the person as well who put that question up. So there is a chapter, we address climate obstruction in the global south. The kind of sad thing is that most of the empirical knowledge is about the global north. So there's a lot of evidence about what's going on in Europe or North America or Canada and to some extent Australia. But when we looked and tried to collect authors to focus on the global south, there's just a lot less peer review. So we were trying to focus on peer-reviewed studies. There's just very few peer-reviewed studies on this particular problem in many of those countries. So for example, very little is known, not that you put China necessarily in the global south anymore, but very little is known about how this plays out in countries like China, but also in countries like India and parts of Latin America. So the first point to make is just the lack of evidence. Colleagues and the Climate Social Science Network, which I'm a part of, it's about 800 members worldwide. We're trying to address this and provide some research funding to do more work in this area. The other point to make about research in many of these countries is many of them are authoritarian countries, and there are risks with undertaking some of this research. That said, we've seen climate obstruction, on steroids, I guess, in places like Brazil under the Bolsonaro administration. One of the co-editors of the book, Carlos Milani, is an academic in Rio de Janeiro, and so he's done some work in that space. But what you do see is some political leaders that have that bent, are willing to, I guess, just allow climate obstruction to very similar to what you see in the US. So it's an issue in the global south. But the problem is we know a lot less about it. We don't have good understandings of who the actors are, the networks, who's funding them, to what extent it's foreign funding or funding that is coming domestically. So there's a lot of unanswered questions for many of those countries. And hopefully, and I do know colleagues are doing more work in that space. So if you're interested, feel free to reach out. And I know there's studies that will be coming out over the next 12 months on that topic.
Thanks, Christian. That's great to know. There have been a couple of questions come through now about the current geopolitical context. Obviously, the war in the Middle East, rising oil prices as a result. Are there any reflections that either of you can share on what that might mean? Either, hesitate to say an opportunity because obviously it's an awful situation, but is there a framing that can come out of that in terms of the shift towards renewables, or is it also an opportunity potentially for climate obstructionists to also take a firmer stronghold as well? So maybe I'll come to you first on that, Marian, and then Christian.
Yeah, I think it cuts both ways. What's happening with the crisis now, with the energy shock coming out of the war on Iran. In the short term, clearly, fossil fuel stocks are soaring, and no doubt there'll be a lot of profiteering going on. And we don't know how long prices will stay up. I think that will encourage a lot more probably investment in places outside the Middle East, but investment in fossil fuel production outside the Middle East. And I mentioned the CERAWeek conference that is going on at the moment in Texas. And one of the reports I was reading from that was Chevron in particular talking about how this will be an opportunity, a real opportunity for Venezuela's rebirth as a kind of global oil major. So I think that will be one side of it. I think the other side of it, though, is that the Financial Times had a very interesting story that along with the surge in oil and gas stocks, the other stocks that are surging at the moment are the stocks in Chinese battery and storage companies. And I think that particularly for countries like China, who are well ahead of the curve on renewables and battery technology now, they will be thinking they're absolutely on the right path. And I suppose the issue is, does that spur not only their increased commitment to that path, but does it also spur some more of the breakthroughs that we're really hoping for in long-term battery storage, where you can seriously look at things like electric trucks, mining trucks in particular, having battery storage or being able to swap batteries to make them a lot more efficient. In Australia, as we know, one of the big things we're suffering is the fears over shortage of diesel, especially for both farmers and for miners. This is a classic example. We've had the issue of when will the miners start converting from diesel to electric, big trucks, big vehicles? They always keep saying it's not time, it's not time, it's not time. They're getting really big diesel rebate funds that will give them no incentive to change, but perhaps something like this may give them an incentive to change.
Christian,
Well, yeah, I don't have a lot to add on what Marian said. I totally agree on kind of the short-term impacts versus the long-term. We're going to see these short-term gains for fossil fuel firms, and perhaps over the longer term, we might see that demand drops more quickly than it might have after this crisis. But for many countries, including Australia, they're kind of at a crossroads now, right? There's kind of two pathways governments could go. They could go perhaps where the Trump administration will no doubt go, which is very much doubling down on fossil fuels. Let's increase fracking and production. I think we've also already seen some political leaders argue that we should be doing oil drilling in the Australian off the coast of South Australia, etc. So there'll be those calls, no doubt, by folk that have an interest in promoting those industries. But of course, there's the other way to go, which is just to double down on renewables. I mean, we wouldn't be in this situation with this liquid fuel security crisis. Well, we'd be in this situation, but it wouldn't be as severe if Australia had electrified its transport sector a decade ago. So we're kind of paying the price right now for slower action on climate change. We'd have a lot less demand for imported oil from countries in the Middle East if Australian households weren't as reliant on internal combustion engine cars. So what we're seeing now is somewhat entirely outside of our control. But on the other hand, it's also a failure of policy where there's big economic and energy security gains is what Marian's talking about with the trucking industry and on mining sites. If we can get that technology up and we can get miners moving, then there's huge gains to be had there for Australia. We have abundant renewable energy and so forth. But of course, that requires, some hard policy decisions, including, as Marian was saying, removing some of the taxation benefits like the diesel tax rebate for these industries. Of course, this is really a boon for China too, as well. So I won't repeat everything Marian says, but we are facing a liquid fuel security crisis right now. We've got some of the lowest stocks of petroleum onshore of advanced countries. If the crisis continues, there's every likelihood that we will face fuel rationing here, but it doesn't have to be this way. And there will be another oil crisis in the future. There will be, sadly, probably another Middle East conflict. So if we're going to be better prepared for the next one, then let's double down on electrifying the transport sectors and other sectors that rely on imported fossil fuels.
Thank you for those reflections. Christian, this question is for you. It's so the questioner makes the point that while there are obviously bad faith arguments and tactics used to delay climate change, arguing that certain policies won't be effective or, perhaps won't have a damaging and so forth. There's also genuine good faith policy debate that can occur, and people can have different views on the right policy pathway to take. So the question is, does the book kind of grapple with that nuance, or have you seen that nuance? Is there sort of a grey area there between what amounts to climate obstruction and where there actually is genuine policy debate about the right approach to take?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's an important clarification. So the book is focused on climate obstruction, not opposition to climate policies necessarily. And so in the definition, and we spend a lot of time talking about this as authors, is that in the definition you'll see in the book that it says intentional actions to slow or block climate policy. So we're not talking about a community group that might oppose a wind farm because for aesthetic reasons, or they don't want it in that location. That we don't classify that as climate obstruction necessarily. It's when actors have a specific intent to block a policy because they're trying to slow action on climate change. So debates about what's the most effective policy, what rate to set a carbon price at, should you have emissions trading versus a carbon tax, should you have fuel efficiency standards versus phasing out internal combustion engine cars. These, whoever put the question up, these are, I agree, totally legitimate debates. We wouldn't put them in the basket of climate obstruction. We need to be able to have these policy debates as we should. What we're talking about is these examples, like I mentioned at the outset, a firm like ExxonMobil knew exactly what they're doing, understood the science, and then went out and tried to deny the scientific basis of climate change. Or grassroots groups that are set up by a gas firm simply to sow doubt in a community. These are cases of climate obstruction. I think what the question is talking about is not that's proper policy debate, which we see a lot of in this country and is very important.
Thanks, Christian. That's a very helpful clarification. Marian, I'll address this next question to you. You made the point earlier about how important it is for our politicians to actually be talking about climate science. There have been a couple of questions come through around climate science literacy, both amongst our politicians, but also the general public. And do you see that being a potential barrier, that actually there just isn't perhaps as much understanding of climate science and the potential pathway forward to addressing and meeting the 1.5-degree goal as there should be? And that's a barrier to then dealing with some of the obstructionist tactics that we're seeing.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we've actually, since Glasgow, I think we've seen a real fall off in the discussion around climate science. And interestingly, when before the Labour Party got into government, I think they were much keener to talk about climate science than they are now. I mean, Chris Bowen obviously has his hands full with the energy transition and the current energy crisis. But he will only very occasionally mention the climate science, and people like the Prime Minister rarely mention it at all. The people who still talk about it, I guess, are the crossbenchers, the Teals and the Greens, etc. I think what I would like to see on that is whether it's government or whether it's more coming out of universities like ANU that has a fantastic coterie of climate scholars, obviously in the Climate Disaster Centre amongst others. But I would like to see a lot more profile of people like that talking about what is happening in Australia now with climate change and the threats that are sort of emerging over the next 10 to 20 years. And that is everything from, like we know, in agriculture, in fishing, in what's happening with our Pacific neighbours, what's happening obviously with flooding and bushfire threat. But I think that, I've reported on fantastic work that has been done out of ANU, out of UNSW, out of Queensland University over the years. For some reason, I'm not quite sure why, the prominence of those scientists and the kind of work they were doing seems to have really kind of dropped off the radar. And I think it's quite important that we get articulate climate scientists back into the public space a lot more.
Thank you. And I should note there are also some suggestions and comments coming through in the Q&A as well. So thank you everyone for engaging. A suggestion that there's a piece of legislation in Chile which enshrines that not the scientific basis shouldn't, not having certainty shouldn't be a reason for taking action, for example. And I'm sure there are many other examples we can look at worldwide. We also had a question. So the question was specifically, this is going to the international sphere and perhaps, slightly indirectly related, but I'm curious in both of your thoughts. Do we think it's possible for ecocide to be recognized as a crime? I might frame that slightly broader. And do you think either the ecocide campaign or other international efforts that are really focused on fossil fuels and on trying to create sort of international obligations on this issue might be helpful in tackling some of the climate obstruction tactics that we're seeing? I'll throw that open to both of you, whoever wants to jump in first.
Well, I'll jump in only. I'll jump in
You
only
go
to
ahead.
say this is probably a question for Rebecca. So Rebecca's working for the organisation that's advancing this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. So Rebecca, you might like to say a little bit about that because it's been a terrifically successful campaign. But I think some of these global initiatives are important. You have to be operating at different levels, both domestic campaigns for climate action, but also the work that Rebecca and her colleagues are doing, getting, I think, well, Rebecca, you can say more about it now, but there's quite a few countries now are signing on saying, we're going to try and stop the proliferation of fossil fuels. But Rebecca, perhaps you might like to say a little bit about that initiative, which means incredibly successful.
Sure, thanks, Christian. I appreciate that shout out. And yeah, so I work for an initiative called the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. There's 18 countries at the moment supporting it, but a few more waiting in the wings that will hopefully be signing on soon. And the idea is essentially that there are gaps in international governance when it comes to fossil fuels. The Paris Agreement is critical, but it doesn't address this issue. And I think that's where ecocide comes in as well. There are a few different international levers that we can pull that we haven't yet that could help enshrine sort of legal obligations when it comes to the environment and fossil fuels more specifically, that would then help place pressure on national governments to take action. So I think ecocide's one of them. The initiative I work on, the Fossil Fuel Treaty, is another, which is focused on obligations around ending expansion and phasing out fossil fuels, but also mechanisms to help countries that are dependent and want to move away but can't. So hopefully that gives a little bit of an explanation of that. And I guess also appreciate the opportunity to jump in on that question as well, because I do think international law has a really important role to play here as well. I'm not sure, Marian, if you also wanted to offer any reflections on that question.
Well, I'd like your thoughts, Rebecca, because of what you're doing at the moment. But what I thought was very intriguing last year was the International Court of Justice decision on climate change, and what it obviously means for the small island states, Vanuatu and other countries, but also how much you think that is going to further that issue of countries, specific countries who are seriously impacted or they're on the front lines, if you like, of climate change in the small island states, whether that what you're doing will kind of work with that ICJ decision, or will it have any impact on the work you're doing?
Thanks for that question. And for those, I'm sure there are probably some in the audience that know more about this than I do, but for context, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion last year, which found, amongst many other things, that continued consumption, production of fossil fuels licensing and subsidies could be internationally wrongful acts. And the consequence of that is that countries could be held liable for those acts, and that could also open the door to things like reparations, actually paying compensation to Pacific countries and those that have been impacted by climate change. There's a long way from a court saying this may be the state of the law, but right now, to that actually sort of being enshrined in either a treaty instrument or states actually bringing cases, requesting reparations to the International Court of Justice. But it has, I think, given a lot of fuel to the fire of countries that are trying to argue that, because there shouldn't be continued production of fossil fuels. So I think it's really helpful. It's also potentially really helpful in national courts, because it now gives a little bit more ammunition for those that are trying to bring strategic litigation, also for, against some of the big carbon majors, like Christian mentioned earlier, to say, well, the ICJ has found that continued fossil fuel production is, an international wrong. And so countries shouldn't be doing it. So definitely, I think the challenge is that although the ICJ found that there's no clear, explicit obligations, there's nothing that's sort of enshrined that says this is what countries have to do to phase out fossil fuels and expansion of fossil fuels, ban advertising, or whatever the kind of obligations might be. There's nothing that articulates that clearly. So at the moment, it's sort of still somewhat easy for countries to ignore or to claim that they're meeting their obligations. So it would be helpful to have, a treaty or some other instrument that does articulate those more clearly. But it definitely is helpful. And I know there have been, the efforts of Pacific Island students and governments to bring that opinion about in the ICJ was really amazing, and I think will have far-reaching implications. Well, thank you for the opportunity to jump in on that question. I appreciate it. We have a couple more that we'll come to before we wrap up. So there has been a question about, I guess we've talked about the geopolitics in terms of the Middle East. There's also a question around the role of the Trump presidency, and has that had any impact on, particularly on Australia's response to climate change and how we're dealing with some of these things? So again, I'll throw it open to both of you and see. Maybe I'll go to you first, Marian, and then we can go to Christian on that question.
Well, of course, the Trump presidency has had a massive impact on globally on the climate change effort, and I think you absolutely see it in Australia. I mean, pulling out of the Paris Agreement is really just one aspect of it. Far more fundamentally, I think there's been, this new narrative on climate change and climate change language has definitely come from the Trump administration, and that language says that fossil fuel permanence is here, that all human endeavour is spurred by energy, and that energy is essentially hydrocarbons and nuclear, that the expansion of fossil fuels is a national priority. So, in other words, what flows from that is all the incentives, all the tax incentives, all the planning incentives, that all shifts from any focus really on renewables to a complete focus on what they call permanent, baseload power. And as a result of that, I think you see particularly the finance community and the tech community jumping to that tune. There was like a virtual stampede for all these bankers and hedge fund investors who'd signed up to the Net Zero Alliance and the pledge on fossil fuels. They all just dumped it. And I think that's had a big impact on Australian finance and Australian banking. It's had a very big impact on the big companies here, whether it's Woodside or Rio or BHP. And I think it's had a big impact on the opposition. So I think it's definitely, and I also think it's had a big impact, Trump has had a big impact on this in Europe as well, especially in places like Germany. So it's very tricky. But the thing I think that a lot of the followers of this debate are watching now is what China does, and does China dig in on its stance of pushing ahead with its course of electrification, EVs, battery technology, etc., becoming they clearly want to remain the world leader in these technologies. Will their competition influence the global south? Will it also really influence countries like India and South Korea? And will essentially we see a divide happening between where America's going and where China and a whole lot of the Asian countries, the direction they're going to go. I think and at the moment, Japan is very much lining up with the US and the Trump policies, but China for the moment seems to be holding its own course.
I guess it's fair to say that the Trump presidency is going to have a huge impact. I guess I don't think we've ever had a presidential candidate that's been such a threat to climate action, calling it a hoax and a scam. I mean, even George W. Bush was nowhere near in the realm of what Trump's doing, along with the ones that Marian just mentioned. He's also, the endangerment finding that the EPA had, that carbon pollution, is a danger to the welfare of Americans. They've got rid of that finding from the EPA as well. That has a whole range of flow-on effects. I mean, maybe because we're nearing the end, I might try and have some kind of positive point. But I think the one difference so obviously the Trump administration is going to embolden folk here in Australia. You're already seeing it with with some of the commentary from representatives from the One Nation Party and others. But it will embolden conservative groups, far right groups and make their claims seem more legitimate. On the other hand, I think most Australian governments, and I mean like federally, but also at a state level, understand the science of climate change. Most political leaders have a reasonable understanding. Now, they don't always act consistently with it, but when you talk to folk in these worlds, often they get some of the science, but even if they're not always acting that way. So I don't think there's that kind of ideological position that you're seeing in the US. You don't have that here, at least in the governing parties as yet, or at least in many of the governments. But well, I was going to try and stay positive, but we could see, that things could get worse as well. So Australia's in a better position. We have better political institutions than the US. We've got preferential and compulsory voting. We've got the Australian Electoral Commission. It really means that we should, resource those institutions, defend them, and ensure that we don't go down this path like the Trump administration, because otherwise we're going to look back and in 10 years from now, we'll be facing some of the same threats to both our democracy, but also to action on climate change.
Thank
I don't
you.
know how positive that was in the end, Rebecca, but
well, maybe I'll ask one very quick final question and see if there's an opportunity for something positive to come from it. It may not be, and it may not be a question that's easy to answer quickly, but the question was, how do we support young people who clearly understand the scale of climate obstruction and feel that their future is being undermined without offering false hope or placing the burden on them? But is there a kind of message of hope that perhaps we can share for young people or more broadly? To the extent we can do it in a minute or two, let's see how we go. But I realize that might be a big question.
Well, I think, yes, there is a definite message of hope. And in fact, I think it does lie with the young generation, because I think that is the generation that has largely come up in being much better educated about climate change than the previous generations. They're beginning to live through it. They understand it. They get taught the science of it in high school. And in fact, ironically, one of the leaders of Advance was railing about the fact that his daughter had come home from school lecturing him about climate change. But I think there is a lot of enthusiasm with young people who are interested in the engineering and the science and the technology of the energy transition. And I think that's where the hope lies. And I think one of the things I want to say is that when you do dive into the amount of work that is being done, whether it's in China or Vietnam or in India or in Australia, on what's people trying to work on a solution to green steel, green batteries, long-term long storage batteries, and EVs and transport transition to electric trucks. There is a lot of exciting, interesting work being done on that. So whenever I read those accounts coming out of China, and some like Bill McKibben's new book coming out of California, I do get very hopeful, and I am very hopeful that certainly the younger generations are completely open-minded on this, and they're not at all wedded to the fossil fuel future.
Yes, I completely agree. we've already seen, what young people can do through the student climate protests that really shifted the debate around the world, including in this country. There's incredible careers now for young people. What's kind of interesting on the career point is that we know that some large fossil fuel firms now are struggling to hire the best and brightest from younger generations and are struggling to hire, the top caliber people. So I think young people get it. As Marian said, they're educated in the climate science. But for those of them that have a political bent, I encourage you to go and start new organisations, join existing ones. And we've got groups like the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. There's a whole range of groups out there that have shaped and have influenced climate policy. But we also shouldn't leave it just to young people. I think it's incumbent on all of us to do everything we can to try and reduce carbon pollution, because although we might be going past a 1.5-degree world, there is a big difference between living in a 2-degree world and a 4 or 5-degree world, and that's hopefully we can make that work for the rest of our lives, but also our kids and our grandkids as well.
Thanks very much. I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much to both Christian and Marian, both for your reflections today, but also for your broader work on this issue and for sharing with all of us. It's been a really, really great discussion. And thank you also to the audience for all your thoughtful questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of them, but hopefully we made a decent dent. And also thank you to the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions for hosting and organizing this event. I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. This has been, really, I think both it's somewhat saddening, but also I think hopeful that there is a pathway forwards, and it's important that we know what's happening so that we can tackle with it. So really appreciate all of the reflections, and thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, Rebecca, and thanks, Christian, and thanks to everyone listening.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.